I'm Mason Smith. I'm an indie game developer. By day, I'm an animator, but by night and from the hours of 5 a.m. to 9 a.m. occasionally, I'm known as Airdorf, indie game developer. So I made a game called Faith. Faith is about fighting demons who possess the body of a 17-year-old girl and then erupt violently out of her face. By show of hands, how many people have actually played Faith? I've played it a little bit. Great. Who here is interested in horror games, indie horror games? All right, my kind of people. For those of you who haven't seen Faith or played it, I'm going to show you all the trailer. This is All right. So Faith is the story of an exorcism gone wrong during the late 1980s. You play as a young priest who returns to the house where it all began a year later to finish what they started. So I released Faith in October 2017 on Itch and GameJolt. In December of that year, Faith appeared on IGN's listicle of the best horror games of 2017. So I don't mention this to brag, but rather to illustrate what my talk is going to be about today. Here's a character from one of the other games that made it onto the list, and here's a character from my game. Sorry, I'll only keep it on screen for a while for you. There you go, it's gone. Today I want to tell the story of how a retro-inspired, chunkily pixelated nightmare came to coexist in the same space as AAA horror titles that feature next-gen graphics. First, I'm going to cover the inspirations and research behind Faith's visual design. Then I will review key design principles and processes that guided my work. And finally, I will share the results of Faith's visual design and what I've taken away from my experiences. So Faith began with a single question that kind of drove my design process, and that was, could I make an effective horror game using just the most basic graphics that I could think of? Could a game that looked like the Oregon Trail feel like PT? Holy grail of horror games, in my opinion. I gave myself this challenge right after the cancellation of the ill-fated Silent Hills project, Lord bless and keep it, that was helmed by Hideo Kojima and in collaboration with Guillermo del Toro. And yes, I'm still bitter about that. Everyone should be bitter about that. Raise your hand if you're bitter about Silent Hills being canceled. Okay. So I was, and I still am, mildly obsessed with PT. It is my absolute favorite horror game. And I wanted to join the ranks of indie devs who were creating what I call PT-ware, or spiritual successors for PT, so Visage and Allison Road. But I didn't have the funds or the time or the know-how to work with high-fidelity graphics like in the Fox engine or an Unreal. So I decided to make a horror game that looked like it could have existed in the age of the Apple II computer or the Commodore 64 or ZX Spectrum. Like it was a forbidden game that you loaded off of a worn out floppy disk that you had to ask around for. So in order to set the stage for Faith's visual design, I need to take y'all back to the first time I ever got scared playing a video game. I was really young. I was at my friend's house and we were playing Doom. I don't know if y'all have heard of it. It was my first time playing Doom, and I was having a lot of fun, actually, carrying my shotgun around, blowing away zombified soldiers, when suddenly this fireball zooms past me. And I turn around, and far away, down this long stretch of hallway, I saw this. I was horrified. And I didn't fully understand what was happening to me. I had to stop playing. Like I told him to take the controllers. I didn't fully understand until what was happening to me until years later. I heard this quote from the movie The Blair Witch Project. Oh my gosh, what the F is that? How many of y'all know what scene I'm talking about? A few of y'all? Okay. Do y'all know what, y'all know that they don't actually show what the character's reacting to, but what they were actually reacting to was a member of the cast draped in a white sheet and wearing a Halloween mask. So I'm really glad they didn't show that. But we were more scared by what we couldn't see than what was actually on screen. And this quote became the golden standard, and it's my favorite quote from any horror movie. It became the golden standard by which Faith's visual elements were compared, and the most important reaction I wanted to get from players. I wanted them to scream this line. Because fear of the unknown, it creates feelings of dread, and dread is the golden nugget of horror game design. And it just so happens that pixel art, especially from the second generation of game consoles and game computers, has a high level of abstraction, and that abstraction makes for a great medium for creating fear of the unknown. So let's talk about Faith's inspirations. The story of Faith's visual design is a story of constraints. I chose visual design constraints that were inspired by second-gen hardware. I wasn't making a homebrew game, so I was only approximating retro hardware limitations. I was trying to nail a feeling rather than achieve technical accuracy. So I chose a canvas resolution of 192 by 160 pixels because I read somewhere on Reddit that that was the approximate resolution of the Atari 2600. And it's probably not true, but I just ran with it. And to me, it was more important to pick something and stick with it than to be completely technically accurate with the retro aesthetic that I was trying to achieve. So I throttled the game's FPS to 15. That helped me in the animation process, and it made for an overall clunkier experience. I worked with a limited palette, probably no more than 6 or 8 colors on screen at a time, and I used a limited number of objects on screen, and that was completely arbitrary. It was more getting the feeling down than an actual hard number. So to give y'all an idea, this is a visual representation of the pixel real estate I gave myself for Faith versus a game running at 4K. Can y'all see that? There should be on this side, yeah, that little orange square. That's what I had to work with versus 4K. I just want y'all to appreciate how much pixel artists can achieve with so little. 192 pixels by 160 is a 6 by 5 aspect ratio, which afforded me more vertical space than 4 by 3 or 16 by 9. And that's something that I kind of gripe about with modern game monitors. It's so horizontal and stretched out. And I get like field of view and all that, but I kind of miss verticality in our sprite design and environment design. So I really enjoy designing environments with a little more verticality in the scenes. So fine art-wise, Faith has a few big inspirations. So my background is in animation, so I've studied a little bit of fine art. This was a big inspiration, Christina's World by Andrew Wyeth. I really like how the visual elements in this painting are minimally arranged. And not that it's a minimalist painting, but its elements are arranged in kind of a sparse fashion. There's lots of visual tension here, and to me, there's a sense of foreboding, and it really gives me feelings of isolation. Francisco de Goya happens to be my favorite painter, and I really like his black painting series. They're very macabre, and these scenes are pulled out of darkness to me. The predominant color is this black, mysterious field, and that's why Faith has a permanent black background for the same reason. And of course, no good piece of horror wouldn't take inspiration from the art of manga artist Junji Ito. Hope I didn't butcher that name. I probably did. Let's move on. So, from a research standpoint, Faith takes place during the satanic scare of the 1980s. Who did time in the 80s? I did 2 years in the 80s. Okay. The rest of y'all, listen up. So the satanic scare of the 1980s was a period of widespread paranoia about Satanism, devil worship, and occult practices like the band Kiss and Dungeons and Dragons. I wonder how Harry Potter would have done in the 1980s. I wanted to recreate the world of the unassuming bourgeois middle class that was in the height of the decade of excess. In order to do that, I had to reject some visual stereotypes that we game developers have created about the 1980s. First, No blue and pink neon cyberpunk cityscapes. Like that wasn't the 80s. Like that wasn't an actual thing. Instead, I researched. So I researched floor plans and architectural drawings of big suburban homes with interconnecting rooms. No DeLoreans. Who declared the DeLorean the car ambassador of the 1980s? Like, how did that happen? Get out of here. Just give me a four-door sedan. And I said no to the 80s punk aesthetic just for this game. I wanted boring, working-class adults who still dress like it was the 1970s and then force their kids to dress the same way. It's not the idealistic, nostalgic vision of the 1980s that we've created, but I think it's something a little more authentic. Because there's a dark side to the 1980s. There's these things called payphones, and if you didn't have money, then you couldn't call home, and like there's no GPS or way to kind of put yourself on Google Maps if you got lost or something. So looking at my process, the process of representing objects and characters from this era as pixel art, it was more of an additive than reductive process. So rather than take my reference images or an image and reduce it to my canvas resolution, I would just start from nothing, and I would pull that object out of the black background until it was just enough detail to be recognizable, rather than taking away detail. But with images so minimalist, it was a challenge to not, what I call, overproduce certain objects and environments. Oftentimes I would go back and actually take pixels out and take details out of a sprite or a scene that I had created. And I really had to just trust the charming, nostalgic appeal of these old chunky pixels and simply walk away from working on a sprite once it was there, once the representation was there. And then for the demon design, these are just a couple. Besides keeping it ambiguous and creating that fear of the unknown, just pulling off of really common things like spiders and blood. We're naturally disturbed by those things. So adhering to Gestalt principles helps tighten the composition of even the most minimalistic scenes. Here in these images, I'm using the principle of negative space to imply paths in the woods that are meant to mislead the player. Without giving anything away, you can actually get lost by following these paths, so you can't trust them. Some more examples of negative space. On the left, I created a cramped space that is also isolated from the outside, thanks to this large field of black, this large amount of negative space around the environment. And the player wonders what is lurking around outside of that little window. In the use of negative space on the right, it creates anticipation and unease with the placement of those sewing mannequins. The player knows that something is going to happen with them because of how they are positioned relative to the player. Negative space is a great little technique to harness that feeling of unease and anticipation. So arguably the most distinguishing visual elements of Faith and the most popular are these rotoscoped animations that play throughout the game. My inspiration was this critic's accolade that I saw in the trailer for The Witch in 2015. It feels like we're watching something we should not be seeing. There he goes. And that became my rationale for subjecting the player to these animated sequences. I wanted to shatter the expectations of players who were probably expecting something like the mini games from Five Nights at Freddy's. So they were getting used to the chunky pixels and getting used to how things moved and how things worked. There's something very unsettling about suddenly switching visual styles on the viewer, much like these uncomfortably detailed close-up drawings from SpongeBob and other cartoons. When I saw that, I knew that I loved SpongeBob. That was the moment. It catches the viewer or the player off guard. So these rotoscoped animations also had the effect of reaching out to the player. Again, I wanted this to feel like a cursed game that was sentient and knew about the player, knew their fears, like the game itself wanted to scare them. And at the very least, we humans are disturbed by images that fall into the uncanny valley. We naturally get uncomfortable watching things that move like us. And the animated monstrosities in Faith have this uncanny quality because they're based on real human performances. It me. So there I am shooting reference for the stabby scene. That's enough of that. So having a little bit of stage acting experience from high school and knowing that no good animator starts an animation without shooting reference first, I performed all the rotoscope scenes myself. So here you can see me editing. After I edited the original footage, I edited it to take out frames and mess with the timing to make it a little more unsettling. So my process was pretty straightforward. First, I would wait till my wife was at work, and then I would then I would get in costume. Then I would film what I wanted to do, and it's kind of therapeutic. So after I was done filming the footage, I would scale the original footage to my working resolution and import the frames into Photoshop and convert it to 15 frames per second. Then I would hand trace the outline of the character for the cutscene and fill in things like the face or any colored fields that I wanted to have, or any solid fields of color, and on another video layer. And then finally, I would add things like facial features and other elements specifically to the character on another video layer. And most of that was a little bit of keyframe animation and filling in the in-betweens, but most of it was just straight ahead animation where I was just trying to make something grow out of a face or have blood drip down from a mouth. It was mostly just straight ahead stuff. So using Photoshop's video layers, it was a very non-destructive workflow which I really appreciated as an animator. I probably wouldn't have gotten these done without it. On average, each rotoscope scene would involve 75 to 120 drawings. So the result was a disturbingly lifelike animation that brought the chunky pixels to life. This is all me. There's me in my Texas apron. It actually required 2 shots. There's me in a mirror. So animating at 15 frames per second was a smart move, really smart, considering the amount of drawings I had to do. Our eyes have kind of our own kind of natural frame interpolation when we look at moving images or changing images. This is something that Richard Williams, a famous animator, called the persistence of vision. So we produce an ocular after image when we look at a changing image, and basically one frame bleeds into the next frame and effectively fills in the gaps for us. A lot of players remark on the smoothness of the animations when in reality they're running at a very low frame rate. So talking about the results, these are chat messages from a streamer, from a Twitch stream, someone who played Faith. So there are many ways to define success in indie game development. For us horror game designers, we actually have the added pressure of scaring the player on top of entertaining them. So based on player reaction, I think Faith's unsettling visual design contributed to its effectiveness as a horror game. So here's what I want y'all to take away from this talk. Basic graphics can be scary. Of course, a good horror game combines not only the visual elements, but the audio, and it needs good scare design, needs good scenario and level design, just like any game. But if you don't have the means to work with cutting-edge graphics, or the time, or the patience, your visual design can still contribute to a feeling of horror. I just stuck to one aesthetic, and working within my constraints, I had a lot of fun with it, and I think it turned out pretty compelling. I should probably change the first point to basic graphics can still support your game's vision, because the research and design techniques and the processes that I've spoken about can apply to non-horror games as well. So the tech for video game graphics has gone so far into the future, and I hope some consideration, if possible, can still be made for those of us who are stuck in the retro era. Second, constraints can set you free from creative block, free from stylistic inconsistency, and free from the expertise or time or funds needed to develop cutting-edge graphics. And I, for one, I'm an evangelist for these retro-inspired horror games, but I still enjoy modern graphics in games myself, and there's definitely value in them. But if you want to make horror games, but are daunted by the skills gap of creating good graphics, then join us. There's a lot of us. We're growing. We have scan lines. We have dithering. We have affine polygon transforms. Retro-inspired horror is a thing, and lots of indie horror devs are combining their design skills with the nostalgia aesthetic with terrifying results. Y'all should probably know this by now. This is FNAF. Nun Massacre by Puppet Combo. He's kind of the king of PlayStation era throwback games. Paratopic, which just won an award last night. And this one's called World of Horror. I really like this aesthetic. So you can find me on Twitter. There's my email. And if you want to support my work, you can find my games on itch and GameJolt. I released Faith Chapter 2 in February, and I released my most recent game called The Wind yesterday morning. And it was actually, I was on a deadline. I was actually commissioned by IFC Films, who released The Babadook, Human Centipede, Autopsy of Jane Doe. They asked me for an Oregon Trail style horror game. So there is a demand for retro-grade horror. And I hope this talk was encouraging. I hope this talk kind of illuminated the visual considerations that went into a retro horror game that could stand its own against AAA horror titles in some aspects. Thank you. Looks like we got maybe 3 minutes for questions. Oh, don't leave me hanging.
Exhilarating. So now that Faith and The Wind, I guess, are out, where do you plan to go from here? Are you going to work on something in the same style or branch out from what you're currently doing?
That's a good question. So you're asking what my future plans are with kind of my retrograde horror style that I'm in. Faith Chapter 3 is eventually going to happen. I wanted it to be a trilogy. But I would actually like to branch out of like the Atari era or the second generation at some point. Maybe go into this newfangled thing called the Famicom, or maybe this 3D graphics stuff with the PlayStation era. I really enjoy PlayStation 2 survival horror titles. I think they have a charm on their own, and I don't know how this happened, but that's apparently retro now. And I want to get into that eventually. Thank you.
Hey, I love the series. It seems like because they're lo-fi, you could probably like produce these pretty quickly, right?
I'm sorry?
You can, since they're kind of like lo-fi, you can kind of work on these and produce them pretty fast. How long does it usually take you to make one of these?
Okay, so you're asking my production cycle. So Faith, I was working a day job and I had other commitments like grad school, and so Faith was just something I worked on here and there, and it took about 2.5 years to finish. Faith Chapter 2 I was a lot more serious about, and I finished it and the standalone demo in 13 months. But it was not before I established a pipeline and kind of a discipline for how I wanted to constrain myself, when enough was enough for certain sprites and environments. IFC Films gave me a turnaround of 10 days for The Wind.
Oh, okay.
It's about a 5-minute game, but still, 10 days.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hello.
Howdy.
Do you continue to, at this point, maintain your day job and do the 5 to 9 a.m. Production cycle, or is it that you've moved this to your primary focus?
Okay, so you're asking if I want to eventually move into primarily working on Airdorf games as opposed to my day job and other activities. Well, I'm kind of a family man, so family always comes first. And this might be for another discussion, but the work I do, I've gotten some notoriety, but so far it pays for a little bit of travel and a nice date night every week, but it's not something I can hang my life on at this moment. And taking the risk to do that full time is up to each individual. Right now I'm still doing my day job and then working on Airdorf games when I can. Thanks.
Hi, thank you for the talk.
Howdy.
So you mentioned you're an animator. What was your level design pipeline like? Since it seems like you didn't have a background in that, how did you know you were doing it effectively to scare your players?
So specifically, what were my considerations with level design?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a great question. So there's my timer. Ooh, that's a good question. I watch a lot of horror movies. I'm kind of scared easily in some aspects, and I play a lot of horror games. Basically, when I first saw my first horror movie when I was like in 6th grade, or when I played my first horror game, which I think was Resident Evil 2 for the N64, I knew I wanted to do this. And so what I do is I think of things that would scare me. I personally am terrified of supernatural horror and kind of this religious horror, not just Christian, but there's exorcism stories from other religions that it would blow your mind. They're insane. And I wish we would make more multimedia about it.
Sure.
So a lot of my personal tastes come into play. I prefer a sense of dread. If I watch a movie or play a game and then I drive home and I'm scared to look behind me in the back seat at night, then I kind of log that away in the back of my mind, and I'm like, I want to do something like that. And sometimes it's hard not to copy directly from a movie or a game. Sometimes you can do it for homage's sake, like there's a lot of The Exorcist in Faith Chapter 1. I tend to drift away from jump scares. So my pipeline is I plan everything out on paper, and then I do my beauty pass, which is just like graphics, and then I do my overlay wall pass for things that are layered up on top of the player, and then I do my collision pass where I kind of paint in where you're not supposed to walk, and then that gets thrown into GameMaker. I use GameMaker, and it all kind of, the scares are a lot of iteration.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure.
Hi.
Howdy.
Just had a quick question.
Yeah.
So usually in games that are higher fidelity, you go in and you do the block out with like very simple meshes and
Yeah.
shapes. Did you do that with Faith, or did you kind of just draw a thing and know you wanted it to be that way, like from the get-go?
That's a great question, and it just so happens when working in pixel art, you're already blocking things out because pixels are blocks. And but you bring up a great point. I do have to do a lot of pen and paper stuff, and oftentimes especially with Chapter 2, I was very not sure of myself because it was a sequel. I didn't want to suffer from sequelitis or turn it into a Disney sequel where it was too much of the wrong thing, you know? And so I'll often plan it out on paper. I'll write stuff out. I'll write down dialogue, and I'll let it incubate for a while, move on to something else. And I have a small inner circle of friends who are both good designers and easily scared, and I'll run things by them. And when it's just artistically, it's just something that feels right, and then I implement it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Thanks, everybody.